Rhea watched her husband swallow 5 of her own children, one at a time, and said nothing. Then she planned, in complete secrecy, the exact rebellion that would destroy him. This is the story of the Titaness who brought down a king not with a weapon, but with patience, and who, centuries later, would return to the ancient world under a different name, worshipped with a kind of ecstatic devotion nothing in her original myth ever hinted at. Rhea was a Titaness, daughter of Ouranos and Gaia, sister and wife to Kronos, and worth distinguishing clearly from her own mother. Gaia is primordial earth itself, the ground everything else grows from, while Rhea belongs to the next generation entirely, a goddess of fertility, motherhood, and the wild, untamed mountains rather than the earth in the abstract. Ancient sources describe her as Mistress of the Mountains, often pictured moving through high, wild terrain flanked by lions, rather than presiding over settled farmland the way her daughter Demeter would come to. That mountain association matters more than it first appears, since it's the exact domain that would later expand dramatically under a different name, which this episode will get to. As Kronos' queen, she bore him 6 children: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and eventually Zeus. This channel has already covered what Kronos did to those children in his own episode, but it's worth sitting with what that meant specifically for Rhea. One by one, as each child was born, Kronos swallowed them whole, terrified of the same prophecy that had once justified his own rebellion against his father. Rhea watched this happen 5 separate times, with no ability to stop it, and, for most of those 5, apparently no plan yet in place to change the outcome. Ancient sources describe her grief as genuine and mounting, but also describe her, crucially, as someone who didn't simply grieve. She started planning. When Rhea became pregnant with her 6th child, she went to her own parents, Ouranos and Gaia, for help devising a way to save this one. The plan that emerged was intricate, and by most tellings, it was Gaia specifically who suggested the location and the deception that followed, giving Rhea's rescue the same grandmother's hand involvement that had already once helped unseat Ouranos himself. Rhea traveled secretly to the island of Crete to give birth, hiding the location from Kronos entirely. Ancient sources actually disagree about exactly which cave sheltered the infant Zeus. Some point to a cave on Mount Ida, others to Mount Dicta, and the disagreement itself has never been fully resolved by archaeologists or classicists, with both mountains still competing for the title in modern Cretan tourism. What every version agrees on is what happened there. To keep the infant's cries from reaching Kronos, Rhea arranged for a group of armored young spirits called the Kouretes, sometimes called the Corybantes, to dance a loud stamping war dance around the cave, clashing their spears against their shields whenever the baby cried, drowning out any sound that might give away the deception. This wasn't a detail later poets invented for color. A real inscribed hymn discovered on Crete in 1904, now known as the Palikastro hymn, was sung for centuries afterward, specifically to the young Dictaean Zeus, directly invoking the Kouretes and calling on the god as the greatest Kouros to leap for full jars, fertile flocks, and thriving cities, a genuine surviving piece of the actual cult ritual, not a summary of it. That single inscription means Rhea's secret cover story became the basis for an ongoing, centuries-long religious practice on Crete, not just a story people told about the distant past. Rhea's plan didn't stop at noise cover. By most accounts, she also arranged for someone to physically nurse and raise the hidden infant, and this is where the myth gains 2 more genuinely surprising legacy details. Amalthea, depending on the source, either a goat or a nymph who owned one, fed baby Zeus her milk in that same Cretan cave. In gratitude, or by accident, depending on which version is followed, one of the goat's horns broke off, and Zeus, once grown, blessed it so that it would forever overflow with whatever food or drink its owner desired. That broken horn is the Cornucopia, The Horn of Plenty, still used today as visual shorthand for abundance on everything from Thanksgiving table settings to national seals and coats of arms, and its origin traces directly back to the same secret rescue Rhea orchestrated. Some later sources go even further. Once the goat eventually died, its hide was said to have been fashioned into the aegis, the protective goatskin covering Zeus carries into battle in later myth, meaning the animal that quietly kept him alive as an infant may have ended up, in one form or another, protecting him for the rest of his divine life. Crete's connection to Zeus's birth grew into something stranger over time. Cretans didn't just claim to be the god's birthplace. Some local traditions went further and claimed an actual tomb of Zeus existed on the island, implying the king of the gods had died and was buried there. A claim that scandalized worshippers elsewhere in Greece, who considered Zeus eternally immortal by definition and treated the Cretan tomb story as an embarrassing local myth. In the 6th century BCE, the Cretan philosopher-poet Epimenides responded to that reputation with a single line that would outlive the controversy that inspired it. Cretans are always liars. Because Epimenides himself was Cretan, the statement collapses in on itself. If it's true, then Epimenides, a Cretan, is lying, which would make it false, and if it's false, some Cretans must be honest, which the statement itself denies. Centuries later, philosophers formalized this into the liar paradox, one of the oldest self-referential puzzles in logic, still taught in philosophy and mathematics courses today. The Titus passage even quotes Epimenides by name, calling him a prophet of their own before repeating the line, a direct biblical citation of a 6th-century-old Cretan proverb that Zeus's disputed grave on the island originally provoked. A secret myth invented to keep one infant alive ended up, 1,000 years downstream, tangled up in the foundations of formal logic itself. Before the moment a swallowed stone convinces a Titan king his throne is secure, take a second to like and subscribe. Zeus's own episode, still ahead on this channel, will cover this deception from his side. From Rhea's side, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and presented it to Kronos as their newborn son. Kronos, without hesitation, swallowed it whole, believing his throne secure once again. What's worth emphasizing here is how much coordinated planning sat behind that single, seemingly simple trick. A secret birth location chosen with her parents' help, a covert relocation across open water to Crete, an entire system of noise cover backed by an armed dance troupe, a wet nurse whose own myth would outlive the deception itself, and a physical prop convincing enough to fool a Titan who had already succeeded at this exact deception 5 times before. When Zeus grew to adulthood on Crete and began planning his rebellion, Rhea didn't hesitate to choose a side, and it wasn't her husband's. She actively supported Zeus's return, and according to the later mythographer Apollodorus, played a direct role in helping arrange the emetic potion, prepared with the wisdom goddess Metis, that forced Kronos to disgorge her other 5 children, undoing the damage of years in a single act. When the Titanomachy began, Rhea, a Titaness by birth and Kronos' own wife, stood against her husband and alongside the son she'd spent years secretly protecting. That choice cost her a marriage of untold centuries, but by every ancient account she never wavered or looked back once the decision was made. Rhea's story doesn't end with the Titanomachy. Centuries later, during the Second Punic War, Rome found itself desperate, its army suffering repeated defeats against Hannibal's forces. Consulting the Sibylline books, an ancient collection of prophecies, Roman priests were instructed to bring the Great Mother, Cybele, an Anatolian goddess long since identified with Rhea, directly to Rome in the form of a sacred black meteoric stone, not a carved statue, but a raw, unshaped object believed to be the goddess herself. The stone was imported with enormous ceremony in 204 BCE, and Roman legend adds a dramatic detail to the journey. When the ship carrying it ran aground in the Tiber and couldn't be freed, a noblewoman named Claudia Quinta, whose reputation had been publicly questioned, prayed to the goddess and pulled the vessel loose with a single rope, taking it as public proof of her own chastity. Cybele worship became an official, state-sponsored Roman religious institution almost overnight, with a temple eventually built for her on the Palatine Hill itself, at the symbolic center of the city. In art, she's almost always shown enthroned, flanked by the same lions once associated with her wild Greek mountain days, and wearing a distinctive mural crown shaped like city walls, a visual promise that she personally protected whatever city displayed her devotion, tying her ancient Titaness wildness directly into her new role as a civic protector of the Roman state. That Roman worship of Rhea as Cybele was unlike almost anything else in the ancient Mediterranean religious world. Her priests, known as the Galli, practiced ecstatic rites involving self-inflicted ritual wounds, and some underwent voluntary castration as an act of devotion, modeled on myths surrounding Cybele's own consort, Attis, whose own story tells of him castrating himself in a fit of divine madness before dying and being restored, a cycle Roman worshippers ritually reenacted each spring. Rome eventually formalized this devotion into an annual public festival, the Megalenzia, held every April, complete with chariot races, elaborate feasts, and, somewhat surprisingly for a cult known for its intensity, Roman theatrical comedy, with plays by Plautus and Terence recorded as having premiered at Megalenzia performances specifically. Public processions featured wild music, dancing, and displays that shocked more conservative Roman sensibilities, even as the cult remained officially sanctioned for centuries. Meaning the quiet, patient mother who once smuggled her infant son to safety in total secrecy eventually became the center of some of the most publicly intense religious devotion in the ancient world. One note worth clearing up, since the names cause genuine confusion, even among people who know Roman mythology well. Rhea Silvia, the mortal mother of Romulus and Remus in Rome's own founding legend, is a completely different figure who simply happens to share part of the name, a human priestess, not a titaness, with no direct mythological connection to Rhea at all beyond the coincidence ancient Romans themselves occasionally noted and clarified in their own writing. Much of what we know about Rhea's role in Zeus's rescue comes from Hesiod's Theogony. The Palaikastro hymn preserves the Kouretes tradition in the Titan's own words rather than a later poet's retelling. Apollodorus's Bibliotheca fills in the emetic potion detail Hesiod leaves out, and her later identification with Cybele and the details of that Roman importation come from Livy's Histories of Rome and various Roman poets, including Ovid. The two figures, quiet Greek mother goddess and ecstatic Roman great mother, represent a genuine evolution of the same underlying figure across roughly 1,000 years of Mediterranean religious history. Rhea's legacy sits apart from every other Titan covered this season. She didn't rule through fear like Kronos. She didn't defy openly like Prometheus. She didn't lose a war like Atlas, stay neutral like Oceanus, or get formally integrated like Themis. She worked entirely in secret, inside a system stacked completely against her, and won anyway, not through confrontation, but through years of patient, careful planning that ended with her own husband losing everything. That makes 6 Titans covered so far: Kronos, Prometheus, Atlas, Oceanus, Themis, and now Rhea, each one responding to the exact same collapse of their world in a completely different way. Next on this channel, Hyperion, the light-bringing Titan whose own descendants would come to include the sun itself. Subscribe so you don't miss it.